answer to it, but that was definitely part of it. And I think the other thing was just a more broad educational function of how do people organize, how do people get more power over their conditions, how do people learn to cooperate with people that they were in conflict with, so lessons at that level were things that we brought out. It did happen. One of the stories I didn't tell, this is quite an interesting example of this, is that one of the towns and one of the brass factories that we worked in most, one day they realized that the plant was about to be put on the auction block, be sold off, which in that context meant someone would buy it and close it, almost inevitably. And so the workers connected with an organization that did worker buyouts, and they actually decided to buy the company, and they created a worker-owned co-op that owned the company and ran it, and eventually, because the whole industry was hitting the skids for other reasons, so they ran it for 7 years, which was enough to get, the main reason for buying it was that the pensions were, everyone was going to lose their pensions, and that was enough to get everyone who had been working in the company enough additional seniority to get their pensions funded by the company. So that was a case where what looked like a completely situation like you're describing, a situation that's just defeat and inevitable defeat and powerlessness. It certainly wasn't perfect. It would have been a lot better if it could have been put on a permanent basis, but it did create a situation where these people were able to make significant gains and also to organize themselves in a quite amazing way to have a democratically owned company with lots of problems. I wrote another book that was about a third of it was about his company and his problems. So, and then it wasn't utopia, but it was at the same time an example of people pulling something out of this experience and finding it as a way to give them another mode to act. Yeah.
I just had I had a quick question about some of the principles you mentioned for kind of how to conduct research with appropriate communities in an appropriate way. Like, how would you put respect into practice, or how do you challenge your own biases? How would you do that when working directly with individuals?
Yeah. So one way to challenge your biases is to have other people challenge them. So I have people who worked with me on the team who would say, you're just going out and interviewing the people you're comfortable with, and the people that you're who are more like you in gender terms, in race terms, in kind of just the way my mind works, that kind of thing. And you've got to get out of your comfort zone and go interview more women, more people of color, more immigrants. And so there was a number of people doing interviews, but in terms of the thing, I would go and it's like, okay, I really need to talk to people who are active leaders in such and such a union. And when I did that, somebody else would fall by the wayside in the work I was doing. So that's one way, and then being sensitive to that, open to that, rather than defensive about it. Of course, you're going to be defensive in your first response, but have a second response where you say, you know what, probably they're right, and secondly, whether they're right or wrong, I don't have to be so defensive about this situation. So that's one. And the story I told about, you know, this, you can't understand this as a labor project. For just, you got to recognize that these were ethnic communities. I was a labor historian. That's always, for a long time, been my prime focus of interest. So the fact that somebody said to me, you know what, you're making your focus too narrow, would be another example of that part. I think, and then just asking questions of yourself. Who am I not talking with? We had a lot of, this was an area that had a huge amount of inter-union conflict. It was referred to as the left versus the right, which was, among other things, very inaccurate because it crossed over with ethnic questions and personality questions and all kinds of other things, but that was the way it was talked about. Our team was of people who have natural sympathies with the left. The right was not a right by the way. They were, that was a part of this, what made this so confusing is that people who were called the right would be regarded as progressive trade unionists, not very different in their views from the people who were called the left. So we had to move to a stance of we're not here to settle debates that these people have been having for 30 or 40 years. It's our job to be a platform where different positions and different people can present their positions. And we had to argue that out within the team to get to that approach. Because we had people who initially wanted to show who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. I think that I don't have any cut and dried answer to this, and questioning one's own, you know, stereotypes and presuppositions it's a human problem that occurs in all situations. Having, you know, the idea that you need to be critical, that critical thinking about these subjects and moving beyond pre-established assumptions is part of why you're doing it. And it's a blessing if you get corrected. I think that underlying attitude is a big part of it. I don't think there's any mechanical solution that I know. Yes.
I'm thinking of your book, Hard Time or Common Sense for Hard Times, and I believe you once told me that Stott and Lind critiqued you for that book because you did not provide your own layer of interpretation. You just provided these kind of polyphonic approach of these different perspectives, and how would I'm sure there are. At least those who are studying history, we're constantly told, you've got to have your interpretation, you have your evidence, but you have your interpretation. How do you share that interpretive authority, so to speak, and to what extent do you think that you actually can highlight these different interpretations? Where's your interpretive piece come into that?
Right, good, very, very good question. Let me start by, let me just mention almost all these books are on my website for free download. So anybody who wants to find any of them, just take a look at them and see them. They're all on jeremybrecher.org. Including Common Sense for Hard Times. So again, it's a common refrain of mine, no cut and dried solution. And I think the first answer is it's got to be a back and forth process. It's a repeated process, iterative, as they say. And you always start out with some ideas and presuppositions on anything you do. On the Brass Workers History Project, part of our original conception was that there was something called the New Labor History, which was an academic movement within labor history to do a more rank and file oriented historical account, a less institutional, make labor history less the story of unions as institutions and more of workers and their activities and culture and movements. So we were coming in with that, that interpretive frame. I would say we continued somewhat, that continued to be guiding what we were trying to do, but it became very rapidly filled in by a tremendous amount of knowledge that the people that we were dealing with had that created a much more complex the content to what was going on. So one part of the answer is, it's not an answer, it's an answer to a different question really, which is part of the interpretive part came from the people we were working with. And that was critical. And then what we were contributing in terms of interpretation was in dialogue with that. I think this question is somewhat different for each project. So there are others where I've been more in the role of I'm going to go out, I'm going to take all of other people's ideas and approaches, and I'm going to be the synthesizer of them. And then there are projects where it's much more, we'll go out and get different people's views and understandings, and we'll just put them together, and people can, choose what they like. Readers or viewers can take different interpretations, and they're the ones that make the synthesis. So it's different for different projects and different purposes. In terms of the brass workers' work, I think that our approach was that we had, first of all, because we got the grant and we were the editors and the filmmakers, there was an ultimate authority that went with the fact that we had ultimate responsibility. So for example, somebody gave a story that we believed as historians was false, and we had documentation to show that. We didn't just tell that story as equal with every other story. So we had to make selections decisions at that kind of level. On the other hand, we would usually not either just leave it aside and not use something for that reason, because we didn't agree that it was the truth. And we also wouldn't present it and say this is all a bunch of hogwash, and here's what really happened. What we tried to do was, which involved exercising our responsibility and authority as the people who were constructing that kind of overriding narrative. But we would try to include things that disagreed with what we felt, and then we would either we would juxtapose them in some way or have a note that said, for another approach to this, see so-and-so's interview on the same subject, or we would provide some wider context in which we'd say is, that this was this corresponds to the experience that some people, take for example the question of why the plants closed. So we would quote people saying the reason the plants closed was because the workers were too demanding and so on. And we wouldn't say, and they were full of crap, and don't pay any attention to people who tell you that. So what we would do is then, first of all, we'd have other people who told about other aspects of it, whether it was the the geographical movement of plants, whether it was the technological changes in plastics and aluminum replacing brass, or whether it was different national policies in different countries, because a lot of the plants were outcompeted by countries that actually had national economic policies that supported their developing these industries after World War II. So we would tell that story, and then you could see why somebody in the whose only source of knowledge was the company saying there would be the company that they closed because the thing with the the labor was too expensive. Why somebody could experience that as a reasonable way of interpreting what was happening, and at the same time, if they had known these other things that were going on, they might have had a very different view. So I don't know if that's an adequate answer, but I think that's the, in others, well, and then we would do overall framing. So that was historical, but analytical historical. So when we talked about the transformation of the work process, we would fill in the background of scientific management, and Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was the person who essentially invented time study, and then we would have somebody in the community. We had the guy who introduced time study, which is the biggest local plant. We had an interview with him about the whole process of introducing time study and what they were doing. And then we had workers who had to work under that system describing what it was like to work under that system and how they resisted it. We interviewed him, the guy who had put time study in the early 30s into Skoll Manufacturing Company, and did some of the background about some of the things about why this was not necessarily such a nice thing for workers. And we showed it to him and said, "What do you think?" And he said, "Well, everything you said, this is not, everything you said here is true. It's not a lie. But our intention was to try to make the jobs better, safer, less unpleasant, and that is, from our point of view, what we were trying to do." And we put that quote of his, so-and-so says what their motivation was in doing this. Everyone knows that their motivation is to make more money by making people work harder. I mean, it's not like we had to, refute his saying that was their intention. But from the point of view of this guy, who was quite a decent, thoughtful guy, that probably was part of his motivation. So, maybe in sum, the thing to say is they tried to strike a balance between letting the truth emerge out of multiple voices, and our voice being one of the voices that was able to bring in things that other voices weren't able to bring in. Other comments or questions? Did you have something?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how different your approach is, obviously, than that of a social scientist. And so many of the students here perhaps have that experience of either, we're trying to find out the needs of a community, right? Or here's a questionnaire, right? And now we're going to take all these yes or no answers and collate them and get data. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the differences in the approaches with the idea about what is this knowledge for, right? And what's the practical use? So a social scientist would say, well, look, we're getting all this data. This is very practical, right, what we're doing, and now we can do something with this data. Would you like to address, some of the questions, like somebody who's more used to that approach would have about your approach and why it offers something very special and perhaps different and more useful?
Right. Well, let me first of all say that historians are dependent on all kinds of other researchers and social scientists in the broad sense. So the work that I do, I use things from economists all the time. I use things that were done by sociologists all the time. These are all things, and with interest, presenting them, that material back into the community. In Waterbury, the main city that I was working in on this, there was a then not well known, but later well known sociologist who did studies of black communities. And I'll think of his name in a minute. With surveys, and so I felt unbelievably lucky when I discovered something that wasn't locally known as a source. The study that this guy had done of the black community of Waterbury in maybe 1924 or thereabouts, where he had gone to every 100 families or whatever it was, and collected data in other ways. And that was like both for me to understand the community and for the people in the community to have access to that as a way of understanding their background. So another example is that there was a big housing crisis after World War I in this city, and the companies had actually invested in sociological studies of housing issues, and they had incredible data that they had gathered. For example, they had a scattergram of the ethnicity of every family in every community in the city. So we had a perfect ethnic map of the city. Just an unbelievable thing. And from that, we were able to draw all kinds of meaningful conclusions about who lived where and what they were doing. And it fed into the participatory side, because people could look at those things and say, oh yeah, my aunt moved from there to there at such and such a time, or whatever it was. So there's a direct positive feed forward in that kind of way. That doesn't get to the question about what are the underlying differences, and I think different types of knowledge have different kinds of use. And I would say that this knowledge is related to questions, first of all, questions of democracy. Yeah. And how you can have the knowledge of where all the housing is, but who is going to be in a position to use that knowledge? And if the purpose of the knowledge is, just for example, after the riots in '68 in this community, as you know, you have many stories like this in Washington, but basically there was urban renewal, and there was the building of a bank, a police station, and I forget, but there's a row of new buildings, one housing block and a road that was created between the North End, which was at that time a predominantly black area, and the downtown. And it was like it's like imagine a line, the fortified line between the black community and downtown. I don't know if they did surveys before they did this, or what. You know, they obviously had to know where the black population was. But some knowledge of this kind can be used for very, in a way that's inimical to the people who are the objects of the knowledge. And I think the core of this, the core difference is that the people who are the objects of the knowledge and the people who are the subjects of discovering and creating the knowledge are in part the same people. So I think that's the big difference. It doesn't invalidate the more conventional sociological knowledge, but it does raise the question about who's it for, who gets to structure it, whose story gets told, and how it gets used. And the more sociological knowledge can get used in a way that is politically democratic and appropriate and humanistically appropriate in the sense that it helps to point out who they are, where they came from, and so on. But it's designed in a form that is necessarily contribute to that purpose. But you can do it. I mean, there are plenty of social scientists who, in fact, contribute to the same processes and values that I've been talking about.
Thank you.
Is that
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
okay?
And I think from what you're saying, the historical narratives can also be used that way too, even
For
in
sure.
terms that it's strictly about what were the causes of deindustrialization, so that this is really also kind of that question of how is that knowledge cuts across disciplines beyond just sociology.
Yes, and I also want to say that one of the other things people would say back to me is, yes, but this knowledge is objective. The social science knowledge is scientific, and the answer that and that's unlike what you're talking about. And the answer that I would give is different types of knowledge require different methodologies, but in order to be knowledge, any methodology has to have controls. It has to have ways of saying what the degree and kind of truth of what it's doing is. And it's different. Novels and science fiction are great things, and they are tremendously valuable parts of human life. But I think it's very important to say they are different from both not only social science but also history. And the reason is that history tells stories, but it has criteria that have to be followed for whether those stories fit the historical definitions of truth. There are other definitions of truth, and they aren't invalidated by the historical definition of truth, but they do have to. But historians have criteria that they have to use, and if they don't, then it's bad history, and someone else can hopefully will come along and say, you know what, this is not a good interpretation because you ignored these 4 facts and make you think differently. And that's why I said a critical approach is one of the aspects of this work. It's one of the important aspects of it.
I see many folks. I would have to confess I've done over 4 hours of interview, 8 hours we've determined of interviewing with him, and I could do hours and hours more, but I'm going to save you guys all. I know we're getting close to dinner time. There are, in fact, 8 hours of oral history interviews done with Jeremy that we will post on the Humanities Trek website. So we'll get that up. Certainly, I'm sure if you wanted to reach out and ask further questions of Jeremy, he's extraordinarily generous. I'm super thrilled that you've come to spend the afternoon with us, and thank you all for coming out. Certainly, this has been very relevant for the Humanities Truck, and I think the idea of really engaging in that in the kind of humanities different kinds of approaches that engage the humanities. We didn't really even get to talk about the real kind of motivations behind his interest in music, but that kind of gets to that as well too. But any case, I will say thank you, Jeremy. And